a lot of the news cycle is spinning around the fact that there was another big dump of documents from the Epstein files and the Epstein Files Transparency Act. And the Justice Department dumped more than 3 million pages of records online last Friday. Along with it, over 180,000 images and 2,000 videos. And since that dump, news agencies around not only the nation but around the world have been trying to go through all of these documents. And the New York Times was the first news agency to discover that amongst those were 40 nude photos from Epstein's apparently personal collection that included not only the nude bodies, but also the faces of at least 7 young women or possibly teenage girls in locations that appeared to include his private island and bedroom. And the Times alerted the State Department over the weekend, Saturday, and then again on Sunday, when they had flagged even more photos. And so the question was, why weren't these things redacted to begin with? And the Justice Department said, well, we're working around the clock to address victims' concerns, but the victims themselves and their advocates are furious about this, and they're taking it a completely different way, saying that the government basically had no interest in trying to protect the victims. So, to talk about this morning is Jody Neal. She is a child abuse expert and survivor. She owns Neal Now Legal. She spent over 20 years prosecuting crimes against children, and it was after 20 years of doing that she publicly shared that she was a survivor of abuse. She has a book that is going to be coming out called Outcry Witness that goes through the legal, psychological, and human impacts of breaking silence around abuse. She now joins us on the air. Jody, thanks for being with us this morning. We appreciate it.
Good morning. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah. I realize we're talking millions of pages, but still somebody hypothetically went through this information before it was released. Otherwise, some of those pages and some of the other stuff wouldn't have been redacted to begin with. How does something humiliating like this happen?
That is a great question, and I have insight from doing large document e-discovery in the opioid litigation. And what it looks like to me, based on the release of the first batch, which also had very rudimentary redactions, is that the DOJ actually did not put eyes on every document that was released. Through the process of technology-assisted review, TAR, it looks to me like there were some gaps, and because there's no way a human with eyes would have released this.
Well, yeah, although there are some of the victims that are saying that the errors, though, go beyond a technical glitch. Among them, Annie Farmer, who testified that Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell abused her as a teenager, and she's making it sound like there's more to it than this. What do you say about her particular complaint?
Yeah, I think she's right. I mean, look, so what the technology-assisted review does, and there's, just like all technology, there's really old technology too. And private law has tools that would absolutely keep this from happening. And it's expensive. The government could have paid to do this right, but I really don't think they did. And that's why Annie Farmer has a legitimate grievance. There's really no way to repair the damage that's been done. The government can claw these images back, but the victims who had unredacted nude images shared of them have almost no recourse, and it's the government committing a new crime.
Okay, so when you say it's the government committing a new crime, are we talking about simply a moral crime, or are we talking about a go-to-court kind of crime?
Well, to share a child sexual abuse image is a crime. And, if I was to get a private client who had an image shared, I would have to be very careful about the way that I would get that to potential law enforcement. I can't send it by email. There are very, very strict rules in the federal law about how you get these images from point A to point B, and you're definitely not supposed to release them as part of a public disclosure. So the Justice Department made a pretty serious error here that effectively is a crime.
Okay. Taking a look at the emotional side of it, and you yourself being a survivor, what must this be like for these, now adults that are seeing their nude bodies and faces splattered on the internet by the feds? I mean, what do you think they're going through on just a personal level?
It's a level of re-traumatization that has probably never happened before in the history of humanity. To have an image of yourself out in the public, it's not just Americans looking at this stuff. I mean, the citizen journalists are all over the world. And to be exposed, that is effectively, however many millions of eyes see the picture, that many crimes. And that's what the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children says about child sexual abuse images, is that every time they're viewed, that's another re-traumatization of the victim. And that's why it's so important to identify these photos and get them pulled off the internet. And that's what NCMEC does.
Joining us on the Wake Up Call, it's Jody Neal. She is a child abuse expert, survivor. She is an attorney. She spent 20 years prosecuting crimes against children. She has her own book that is going to be coming out shortly called Outcry Witness. I think, well, no, let me rephrase this. Does this absolutely amaze you how wide and broad Epstein's web really was among the rich and the famous? I mean, it just seems like it is non-ending. How could one guy be able to do this for so long?
Yeah, that's a great question. And what I've come to believe about the Epstein tragedy is that he was basically a dealer of the most sought-after commodity in the world for some people, and that is the bodies of young children. And you can tell from his wealth that his dealership was very highly profitable for him. And, I think we're actually really blessed to have all these emails, because you just don't get an insight into a network this expansive every day. There's a lot to be learned, and a lot of prevention can be designed to keep this from happening again, because you're right, there were a lot of moving pieces. And if someone had blown the whistle sooner, we could have probably saved a lot of victims.
Well, I guess my thing is, is it possible that he was working with others to do this? I mean, there are a number of different theories, conspiracy theories floating out there that, he was potentially connected somehow to Putin or Mossad or whatever, and that it was, a honey trap type of situation, and being able to get information out of these people through threat of extortion and so on. Do you think there is anything to that?
Absolutely. I read Virginia Giuffre's book, Nobody's Girl, right when it came out, and she details from firsthand experience that what you have suggested actually took place. And when you look at the way that human trafficking requires use of private planes, private security, private airports, you know, a lot of foreign entry requirements are being swept under the rug, you know, passport checking, questions that governments want to be asked are not being asked. And I absolutely believe he had assistance throughout the world dealing this human commodity that he had access to.
I'm going to kind of flip this conversation a little bit. You know, I mean, first off, the magnitude of how many files there actually are on this guy is amazing. But just because their name comes up in emails, or there's a photograph because they're at some gala and they have their photograph taken with Epstein, I mean, it doesn't necessarily mean that just because they were in proximity to him or show up in an email that they're complicit in any of this. Do you think that there is going to be collateral damage because of this to people that really didn't have anything to do with any of this? And I'm not trying to, you know, protect anybody here, but I'm just saying, you know, is there a possibility that there's going to be people that are collateral damage that had nothing to do with any of this?
Absolutely. You know, Naomi Campbell is a great example. There's the famous photo of Virginia Giuffre walking into her party, and you can tell she's looking right at her. You know, Does Naomi Campbell really know how old Virginia Giuffre is and why she's there with Ghislaine Maxwell and Jeffrey Epstein? Probably not. She's probably not an actual accessory. But so I do think there's going to be a lot of that. But what I want everyone to really pay attention to is the outcries that will come from these files. I believe that there are so many more so many more victims that we still don't know about who are very likely right now sitting there trying to figure out if it's worth it for them to come forward. And I want everyone in law enforcement all over the country and the world to be mindful that there can be outcries coming from this, and to treat them with respect and to give them the space they need to say the truth about what's happened to them.
Do we know how many more files, or to the extent that have yet to be released? Because apparently there's more.
Apparently there is more, and I really hope the Justice Department, the DOJ, invest in a good tool so that more harm does not come from what is effectively supposed to be a public service, releasing these files. They need to get CS Disco, which is my favorite e-discovery tool, and put eyes on every image.
The other question I would have here is, how many of these files were already collected prior to Epstein's last arrest, and what percentage was collected after his suicide in prison or in jail?
You know, my understanding, because there are a lot of government documents in this drop, my understanding is that this data was collected as part of his estate, a conflict in his estate. And, you know, when they were collected, I think it was a long time ago. They've just been sitting, waiting.
For what?
For what we're seeing now, really for a public outcry to reach the point where they will be released. I mean, I think they would have sat in the darkness till the end of all time otherwise.
Well, I mean, you said that they've had these for a long time. Why wasn't there a more robust prosecution? Was it because of the status of the individuals that were involved in this?
When he died, that effectively closed the case for criminal prosecution because he's the primary defendant. Now, Ghislaine Maxwell was also prosecuted, as we know, and she's serving time in prison in Texas right now. But it looks to me like the government didn't have too many more principles that they were willing to prosecute. Now, that might change. The statute of limitations on criminal cases of this nature is expansive. And perhaps they could go after, depending on what the victims say. But really, everything comes down to whether or not the survivors are willing to speak and go on the record and testify in court. And I think a lot is going to depend on survivors who have not come forward, coming forward now and saying, look, this guy is in the picture that corroborates what I know to be true. I hadn't come forward before for all of these reasons that are consistent with what we know about survivor dynamics. I'm ready to participate fully. Let's go get them.
Joining us on the wake-up call, it is Jody Neal. Before we let you go here, talk a little bit about your forthcoming book, Outcry Witness.
Thank you so much. Outcry Witness is a step-by-step guide to coming out of a state of being frozen. We know from trauma research and Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, who wrote Body Keeps the Score, that when someone is sexually abused, they effectively become frozen. Silence is not necessarily a choice. It's a phenomenon that takes place in a survivor's body. And so what I'm doing is baby steps to get the survivor out of the state of being frozen and into a state where they can actually heal. It's called the process of disclosure. And once we can get so many millions of people in the process of healing because they've said the truth about what happened to them, then I really think that our country will be a much better place for our kids. And that is really the point of my book, is to get the adults feeling better so that we can do better for our kids.
All right. Jody, I appreciate you joining us on the wake-up call this morning. Definitely appreciate it. Would love to have you back on in the future as, you know, this dump continues to happen and the ramifications.
Thank you so much. You can count on me. Just give me a holler anytime.
All right. I appreciate that. Jody Neal on the wake-up call this morning.